Storytelling is a relational cultural act. We must come to see our stories as dialogical. We must respect the multiple subjectivities embedded in each voice. We must know that we are as defined by the stories that we tell as we are by those we shirk from telling. We are as defined by the stories we want to hear as we are by those we refuse to hear. Our stories are intertextual, with each story deriving meaning from the other stories. In other words, the weeping 66-year-old white man at my mother's grave has a claim on my story and on my humanity, and I have a claim on his. We each come more fully into our truths as we turn toward each other with clarity and compassion. The Help is a new book, but the author managed to tell a very old story. Our challenge is to learn to tell new stories. And unlike ego comfort food, they may not go down easily. The Help is also a gift. It calls us to a choice point. We can choose to tell stories that feed our self-image and make us feel good. We can choose to tell the stories that give us the guilty pleasure of feeling bad or feeling mad. We can also choose to turn caringly and courageously toward each other and tell the stories that help us feel real.
Thanks, Maureen. That was totally powerful. And now let's hear the story from Christina Robb.
One thing I want to say before I start is that Maureen's wonderful paper is even more wonderful. That wonderful. When you get to read the whole thing. And I'm able to give you one piece of what I had to say. So I do hope that you pick our papers up and hear the whole story that we're telling tonight. I came of age as a journalist just a few years after Skeeter, the brand new college grad, started writing household tips she took from a black domestic worker. Skeeter had no clue about how to run a household, and she had no experience as a reporter, but she had the one unwaivable requirement for a job on the Jackson, Mississippi paper. She was white. She also had no sense or ethics. I know only one way Skeeter could have ethically written her book. From the domestic workers she knew in Jackson, she could have gotten the names of women who had left that work and migrated to Chicago to find better paying jobs there. She could have traveled to Chicago to interview those women after their work where she and they could be safe. As it actually plays out, The Help is so journalistically improbable as to be an untethered fantasy, wishful thinking that slights and trivializes the struggles and suffering of millions of participants in the civil rights movement, which was and is about much more than food and toilets. The book is simply nuts about what the risks were. Like Lillian Smith in Georgia in 1955, all of the journalists in this story, including the white heroine Skeeter, would have been burned out of their homes. Some of them would have been killed. The good white girl is almost criminally unethical in her blindness to risk. Her race and class assumptions blind her work, and her impregnable ignorance of the severe danger she is in greatly increases the severer danger she puts her subjects in. Yet after they finish their project unscathed, which is completely implausible, the reward for the black heroine is first getting fired and then getting a half-time job writing household hints, more food and toilets, a job that doesn't pay a living wage. Meanwhile, the white heroine gets her dream job in New York and goes off to find her first apartment. And of course, these economics mirror the history of racism. The reassuring thing I've learned about The Help, according to Catherine Stockett, its author, is that 60 publishers rejected it. Apparently, when Stockett grew up in the South in the 70s and 80s, the black woman who worked as a domestic for her white family wasn't allowed to use the same toilet as the rest of the family, and little Catherine perceived this as a huge injustice. Food and toilets are hugely important in the lives of small children, and The Help takes that childhood prominence of food and toilets and makes it the central injustice in what otherwise purports to be an adult story. It's sort of like Roger Rabbit. A cartoon reality coexists with plot elements meant to represent history, live action. Stockett moved the time of her story back a couple of decades to the 60s in her book to try to link the toilet thing to the movement that began to change the name and nature of white racism from segregation to racial injustice, a socially constructed reality designed to let white people steal from black people and treat them as a separate subhuman species. It's shameful for me to read a book like this and realize it's had such tremendous popular success with white women. I feel ashamed knowing so many of my people, middle-class European American women, have fallen for such flimsy rose-colored revisionism. But I want to talk about shame, because to me, shame is an indispensable teacher in this work of unlearning racism. Shame is sort of one part plowshare, one part sword. It's bad to do to someone else, but sometimes not so bad to let it work within yourself. I don't think I could stand it if my black friends weren't careful to try not to shame me when we talk about race together. But shame arises in me when I realize they need to be careful. And I think that shame helps me recognize I am not good about race yet, or at least not good enough, and it motivates me to change. Nobody needs transitive shame, people shaming people. That sort of shame is a mainstay of racism and of all forms of oppression. One of the forms that relational cultural theory tells us keep dominance dominant. Transitive shame isolates and disempowers. But there is intransitive shame, the noun, the response. Shame happens. And I believe the shame that arises from that ear-reddening moment of hearing our own deafness to injustice, recognizing that we share in that injustice and pass it along, can catalyze transformation. The moment I began to move out of my white, liberal, good about race complacency into the uncomfortably alert and much more observant anti-racist work in progress I think of myself as now, was a moment of shame. No one shamed me, but shame arose in me early on in a discussion group of professional women where white women were a minority. I made a complacent, good white liberal statement about my family history, and a black member of the group had the integrity and grace to remind me specifically how black oppression was present in that history. She didn't do it to shame me. She did it because it was true. And not to do it would have been to allow my white revisionist history to repress her knowledge of the truth. She did it with a tear. And shame knocked the wind out of me. Shame about the tiredness of my self-protective white liberal line, along with certain knowledge that my knee-jerk liberalism, my family never had slaves, we lived in the North in a free state, hurt her. My conventional way of exculpating myself was not innocent, not harmless, and here was the tear of proof. Since then, I try to see, too often after the fact, how racism warps my sense of self and how I project it. I feel worse in some ways, I suppose. But I see more. And to someone who wants to be able to claim to be an observer of her own life and times and to live the examined life, seeing and hearing more are worth a lot. It feels like I am more, even though I have to admit that the more I feel I am is quite a bit less perfect than I used to think I was. I used to want to say, I'm not like that. Now I'm all too aware that what I am like isn't all that great either. And why should any person of color believe any white person who says, I'm not like that? Saying I'm not like that is like that. It can't be said, it has to be done. And unfortunately, I know I can't always do it. The best I can do is to use the frisson of shame I feel when something emerges from my mouth or even in my mind and triggers shame. I can take that shiver of shame and look at the racist act or thought that set it off and smell out and find the conditioned switch that turns that act on and disable that switch. I can talk it through with close white and black friends who must share with me this process of deconditioning myself because I could not possibly do it alone. The processing often starts with shame because shame gets my attention, and I can only override my conditioned racist reflexes if I notice them. It's learning. Shame marks a mistake. Shame happens, and I know there's something to correct, something I can now work on. Shame marks one specific intersection of me and a system of privileges that privileges me completely unfairly, including giving me the privilege of not seeing the unfairness at all. I can't not be white. Whiteness is bigger than I am. I can't stop anyone from seeing me as white and defining white without asking me. But I can try to see my whiteness and know that willing or unwilling, I am part of it. I can never truly be good about race until my culture is. Until white women don't write the help and white congressmen don't call our president a liar on the House floor in the middle of his State of the Union address. But I can be on the side of change, part of the tide of change, working to make the total theft under that cultural bottom line less.